I'm going to cover the 4 key guidelines for how to do effective sanding, doing it as quickly as possible. That way you reduce the time that you spend doing the most boring process in woodworking. So at the end, we're going to cover what the best sandpaper is. Keep watching. Ray Ruthin here. Welcome back to Woodcrafting Place, where we bring you woodworking knowledge every week, something to help make your time in the shop more effective and enjoy your time that much more. So if you like the content of this video and all the other videos that we bring, make sure you like it, and don't forget to subscribe down below and click the bell. That way you get notified each week of all the content that we bring and all the woodworking knowledge to help you out in any situation you need. And of course, always leave comments and questions, and I will get back to you and get into the tip. Okay, but a quick word about safety. Sanding produces a very fine dust, as you're well aware of. If you haven't yet got yourself a respirator, get yourself a filter, something to protect your lungs. Sanding actually produces the worst possible size of sawdust, very unhealthy to breathe it. Make sure it is properly classified as the proper level filter, and get used to using some eye protection and even your skin. Many types of wood have caused allergic reactions. So the bottom line is use the right protective equipment and you'll enjoy your woodworking. So sanding is defined as a smoothing or polishing operation using sandpaper or a mechanical sander. But it's also a process that's used to prepare the wood for finishing or final application. And for woodworkers, that's the important part of the definition. Keep that in mind, and we'll get back to that definition. So sanding is the most boring and tedious task in any woodworking project. I'll be the first to admit it, but we're going to make a process out of sanding. All right? So 4 key guidelines. Guideline number 1, only the first grit is meant to remove tool marks. All right? Remember that. So when you're going through your grits, you start with the roughest and go to the smoothest. It's the first grit's job to remove tool marks. That's important to remember, because if that first grit doesn't remove all the tool marks, every smoother grit, less aggressive grit, has a much harder time doing its job. Simple, right? Guideline number 2. Need coffee for this one. We use a rule of 1.5 for sanding. What is a rule of 1.5? So after you start with the first grit, and remember, the first grit removes all the tool marks. After that, you go to the next grit, which is 1.5 times that grit. So, going to our board, if you started with 80 grit, your next grit is 120. From 120, you're going to go to 180. 180 to 220. Now I'm going to tell you straight away that if for most woodworking projects, that's where you're going to stop. You're going to stop at 220. The next one is one of the commonly known guidelines. Always sand with the grain, Number 4, keep the sandpaper moving, especially if you're using a mechanical sander. When you get something like this little unit right here, which weighs 20 pounds, if you stop that and you let that rest in one place with an 80 grit sandpaper, it's going to dig right in. And then it gets to be very difficult. So now you have this condition. You have this dish situation right here. Instead of just sanding off high spots like that, you now have to remove all of this wood down to this point to make that a flat surface. This is the most difficult condition to sand out. So those are the 4 guidelines of what you need to do to make sure that your sand as efficiently and as quickly as you can. If you have a lot of surface area to sand, like a floor or a large tabletop, then you're going to use a belt sander. They come in different sizes. You may not use a big unit like that one. You have a small unit. Smaller surfaces, smaller projects. You have vibratory sanders. My favorite, palm sander. 5-inch palm sander is great. It does all kinds of projects, pieces of furniture, small cutting boards, you name it. It's a great tool. Palm sander is nice because of the oscillating motion that it gives you. That way you don't have to worry so much about the marks going across the grain. You're just generally keeping it with the grain, and it does the rest. Now sandpaper. There's a huge number of sandpapers on the market. Aluminum oxide is the most commonly cost-effective available sandpaper. Aluminum oxide is a great paper because aluminum oxide is a softer abrasive. What I mean by softer is it breaks down. So the points break off as you use it, and that leaves sharp edges here. That way it maintains a sharp surface, rough surface, for longer. There's a whole host of sandpapers available. And you can buy them in all quantities and qualities. This basic paperback, aluminum oxide. Spend a little more, you can get this flexible plastic back sandpaper. You might have to try a few, see what works for you best, okay? If you're doing heavy-duty sanding with a belt sander, you're probably going to be looking at cloth back because the paperback doesn't stand up to the machine. All right, so what's the best sandpaper? Well, there's two schools of thought on sandpaper. First school is buy it and use it like it's free, right? In other words, get the cheapest paper you can, like 20 sheets for $5 or something inexpensive like that. Use it a few times till it starts to lose its grit, starts to get clogged, paper breaks down, and just throw it away. That way you always have a fresh piece of sandpaper, which is as aggressive and fast as you can, and it also gives you a nice, smooth, and consistent sanding result. Well, then there's a second rule. Basically, buy the best you can get, make it last, and spread it over as many pieces, parts, or projects as you can. By doing that, you reduce the cost. The stuff I use, as you can see here, is Mirka Abranet. This is what I pick currently on the market for a reasonably affordable price. That is the best sandpaper available. And it's a open mesh, and inside the mesh is the abrasive. It's worn, it is bonded and woven in the nylon mesh. That way it's well embedded into the sandpaper. And with the mesh, it comes with the other benefit of handling sawdust better. So if you're wet sanding and moisture and fluid as well, this sandpaper can actually hydroplane when you're wet sanding. So the water gets between the paper and the object, and it prevents the sanding grit from actually reaching the object as well. This doesn't have that problem. This actually eliminates the water against the object, kind of like the treads on your tire, so that the grit always make it to the part. And if you're using a vacuum setup on your sander, this allows the dust to get sucked up much better than the old style discs with half a dozen holes in them. Much more effective. But it costs more. It costs far more. This pile of grit that I've been using for about 3 years now, that I use in my pen making. I've done 500 pens with this pile. Yes, it's $15 worth of sandpaper. However, it lasts. $15 worth of this is a lot of grit. Cost-wise, my finding is that there's actually no difference. But it's the advantages of using the mesh that you can wet sand completely. You just stick these in water in a bowl, rinse them out, hang them to dry, and they're good to use next time. So that's the great benefit of that type of material, okay? And handling the sawdust, which, remember we go back to the beginning, we said make sure you wear a mask and you're protecting your lungs and your eyes from the sawdust. This makes it that much easier. It does a much better job of allowing the grit, excuse me, the sawdust to be sucked up. So that's it. That gives you how to do the sanding. Do your grits 1.5, the rule of 1.5. First grit, remove the tool marks, always go with the grain, and always keep the sandpaper moving. If you liked what you saw today, remember, like this video and subscribe down below and hit the bell. That way you get notified each week of all the content that we brought you. So the question today for you is, what sandpaper do you use? Have you ever tried the Mirka, or do you use something else? And maybe, I know that the mesh sandpaper has started to show up in other brands. Have you tried some of the other brands, and what do you think of those? I haven't tried the Diablo or any of the other brands that are out there. Obviously I will shortly. However, if you found something that you really like, leave me a comment down below and let's share it with our audience. That way, if the Diablo is as good as the Mirka, it's half the price, let's share it. Let's let everyone know. That's what we're all about. And oh, by the way, if you look down below, you'll see the links for all the materials that we showed you today in the video, and where to buy these things. And yes, they're affiliate links. They help the channel bring our woodworking knowledge to you. I hope you got something from this. Have yourself a great day, and we will see you again soon.